Thanks very much, Joanne. So I'll just give a few remarks, and then we'll hold over for the rest of the forum for questions, in particular for John and Joanne, of which I'm sure you have many. So I was just going to briefly recap sort of what some of the broader impacts of privatisation have been over the last few years, and then talk a little bit about what we think maybe some of the alternative should be, and also the realistic ways we might be able to start achieving that. The first thing I just wanted to briefly recap and focus on the electricity industry, because there's a few myths that come up about privatisation that you still hear occasionally. And one of the most relentless ones that you hear is that private companies are more efficient because they're driven by profit. And if they're driven by profit, then they're going to cut costs and find the easiest and most efficient ways to provide a service. And that was the rationale for the electricity privatisation that occurred in the 1990s. The Australia Institute did a study of electricity privatisation and compared the electricity industry in the 90s to now. They found there was a 400% increase in sales staff, and you can see the rest, 200% in managers, but only a 21% increase in the people who actually make electricity or help provide and distribute it to our houses. In fact, electricity companies now spend more on financing their operations, so paying for debt and things like that, than they do on buying the fuel to power electricity. And that's not just because there's a little bit of more renewable energy. It's in large part because these are highly debt-leveraged private corporations that spend a lot of money on churn. In fact, the biggest component of your retail bill right now is them paying for billboards and telemarketers. The biggest cost for a retailer is what they call customer retention, or CARC. But literally that is just so they can call you and tell you to buy their special yellow electricity. The other big thing is that the three biggest players in the electricity market regularly on average will combine make about $3 billion in profit, pure profit every year. Every single dollar of that in a monopoly like this is money that should be going back either into making our bills cheaper or investing more in publicly owned, I would argue, renewable energy. And then if you just look at, say, take four of the classic privatised corporations that occurred in the 1990s. Last financial year, just before the COVID pandemic hit, their combined total profits was $14 billion. To put that into context, they could fund universal free dental 3 times over. That's the sort of scale of funding that we're talking about, and the enormous extraction of public wealth that's going on. John's, I think, sort of touched on it, but one of the other things that occurred in the 1990s during this wave of privatisation was something very boringly called the National Competition Policy. But what it effectively did was force the remaining public companies to act and function like private corporations. They were forced to pay tax, turn a profit, and act competitively with other private corporations, which effectively helped degrade public support for the remaining public bodies in the 2000s. John mentioned before public perceptions around private ownership, privatisation. That's an essential poll from 2015, and some of you may have seen that before, asking the public who benefited from privatisation. And even Liberal voters, over 50% of Liberal voters acknowledged that the public didn't really benefit from privatisation. That quote, you're probably wondering on the left there, believe it or not, that's a quote from a confidential report into the Labor Party's loss, Keating's loss in 1996. So this is the internal review presented to the Labor Party National Executive. Don't ask how I got it. But that was their view about privatisation. For those who can't read it, Labor's record on Qantas and the Commonwealth Bank, i.e. they sold it off, raised questions about our candour and ideological commitment to public ownership. Selling off national icons was deeply unpopular and raised questions about what Labor stood for. Many of our own people didn't believe us when we said we wouldn't sell Telstra. So even in the 1990s, the public had turned on privatisation, and in fact, the overwhelming feeling that Labor internal polling had post-1996 was the public had nowhere to turn. because the Greens weren't really a big force then. The party that was meant to represent organised labour and social democracy in Australia had turned around and engaged in the most aggressive one of the most aggressive fire sales of public assets in the developed world. And I would argue laid the foundation for Howard. In fact, I think if Keating hadn't gone down that path, we may not have seen the 10-year reign of John Howard. So I think the question then is, and we've thought about this a lot, I think in the Queensland Greens, sort of as a collective group, why is it then, if the public still remain increasingly so strongly opposed to privatisation, have we not seen either a reversal? So John mentioned the prisons, but I mean wholesale, say, the reversal of privatisation in the electricity sector and things like that. Why haven't we seen that reversal? And in fact, why have we seen, if anything, an expansion of privatisation and private markets in other areas, even post the Anna Blythe and Campbell Newman loss? Probably the most egregious example in many ways, and people are experiencing this now, was the rollout of the NDIS, which there's a lot of problems with the NDIS, but for those that don't know, one of the major problems is that it's attempted to create a private market, essentially a privatised market in the provision of disability services, that then people had to act as functional and informed consumers to go and access services that should have just been provided with public funding and public services, like they are, for instance, in Scandinavia. The state government has currently sold off 1,000 units of public housing onto the private market, not sold to the tenants, often evicted them, and sold those houses onto the private market, which is a sort of stealth form of privatisation going on at the moment. So that's that. The Labor and Liberal Party still remain ideologically committed, I would argue, to sort of the notions and ideological tenets that underpinned privatisation in the 1990s. It's just, as John mentioned, there's not really anything else to sell off. They're running out of things, and so they're turning to things like public housing. But when they do even roll out large new services like the NDIS, it's in the form, a privatised form of provision of service. The other big problem is that there's no social force able to bring back or push privatisation. For one, organised labour, which was the major force in a lot of other countries that stopped privatisation or helped reverse it. For instance, I'll go into it a little bit later, but unique examples like Costa Rica, for instance, where they have still remain relatively powerful organised labour, are able to stop a lot of the privatisation of their electricity system. And at the moment, we're not big enough in terms of being able to provide a competing social force or an example, or provide examples of what public ownership might do in terms of benefiting in our lives and things like that. And the final one is anti-politics, which is, while we know there's a lot of opposition to privatisation, the problem is that often, and for those of you who've door-knocked often, you might find this, is when you then talk about the public alternative and say, oh, we want a publicly owned bank, or we want to bring the electricity system back into public hands, the immediate response is, no, mate, that'll never happen. Or, no, that's too hard to do. And this is in the context of a slow and ongoing degradation in trust and faith in our political system, but in our government services and their capacity to deliver and do things. That's partly founded in truth. As John mentioned, government services have been degraded and privatised and cut back. But there's also something that we're competing with here, where people's lives are so disconnected from politics, so alienated from the political system and government systems, that they have no trust in faith that government-owned or publicly owned systems will necessarily provide something much better. All they know is that privatisation just makes it that much worse. And so these are the sort of three factors that we're running into. But I would argue, just very quickly, that there's some strategic and policy reasons why public ownership not only is important, but over the next 10 to 15 years is going to be one of the most important fights that we're going to have. Public policy, but also when we're running in election campaigns and when we're pushing for reforms, when we're in the balance of power, or when we potentially might be in a majority-sharing majority partner in, for instance, even Brisbane City Council in the next few election cycles, which is not beyond the realms of possibility. On the strategic side, one of the really important things about publicly owned, democratically controlled, publicly owned institutions is that they can often, and they have in recent times, remain very important democratic redoubts or beachheads for progressive movements, organised labour, progressive movements like the Greens, to build power outside of the private market. And by that I mean areas where the profit motive doesn't discipline and force people to act in a certain way. To give you a very explicit example, for instance, an electricity system entirely publicly owned isn't subject to the sort of market forces or desire to drive for profit, or the ability, for instance, for massive corporations like AGL or Origin to withdraw their capital or their support in instances where we want to be able to, for instance, transition much faster to renewable energy, or cut people's bills, or reduce the amount of profit that exists in the energy system. That can only really happen if their entire system is publicly owned. The other important one is start to rebuild trust in public institutions. Properly, democratically, publicly owned institutions are one of the perfect ways, and I'll talk about this in a little later, around reforging a positive collective consciousness around politics and our ability to act in society and deliver good government services. One of the big problems that we have right now is that people generally agree with us politically but don't think anything good can happen. And the only way to start beating back on that is that the first time that we get anywhere near power, we're capable of building institutions that can't just be cut back the year after we say we were to lose power, get out of the balance of power, or lose an election. They need to be institutions that outlast governments and political cycles, but institutions that embed in people's lives and people have a stake and want to defend. I think a good example is Medicare, which has been cut back in many ways and is very imperfect and doesn't cover everything. But it's one of those institutions that governments of both colours find very difficult to touch in any meaningful way in terms of cutting it back, because it's a public institution that people feel like they have a stake and some control over, even if it's being slowly eroded at the edges. And then just in terms of public policy, I would argue climate change, an ageing population and care work, and rise of antibiotic resistance, and probably we're going to face more pandemics down the line, and a housing crisis are only going to be solved with democratic public ownership. Ageing population is an obvious one. Having a profit embedded into an aged care sector that eventually is going to be overburdened over the next few years as our population significantly ages, particularly in Western democracies, is completely unsustainable, not only in terms of the abuse we've seen in the aged care sector, but something that's actually going to have to be provided in the same way that we provide public education, secondary and primary education, or public health care. Something that everyone has a right to, regardless of their income or ability to pay. Climate change, I think, is relatively obvious. One of the only countries that's reached 100% renewable energy, or come close to, is a country with basically a fully publicly owned energy system, and that's Costa Rica, because one of the biggest fights that we're having right now is a section of fossil fuel capitalism, but also coal mining corporations and billionaires and privately owned energy companies who have an explicit financial interest in slowing down the transition to renewable energy, because they'll either have stranded assets, in particular like AGL or Origin with large gas or coal generators, or they're generating a lot of profit out of keeping Australia's systems one of the most carbon intensive in the developed world. And fighting that has clearly proved extremely difficult. And the only way that we're going to be able to plan a sensible transition to renewable energy, where we build social consensus for it by reducing costs and giving more people say over what their energy bills look like and what sort of energy we build, is giving people democratic control over our energy system, but also bringing it back into public hands. And housing I'll go into a little bit later. Just to give you some really interesting examples, I mentioned Costa Rica. So in 2017, there was a massive report, like amazingly 99.7% of the national electricity mix was renewable energy in 2017 over the course of the year. So that includes, at night and daytime when the sun wasn't shining. It was a mixture of geothermal and wind. But what wasn't really reported was that this was overwhelmingly generated by and controlled and run by a single publicly owned energy institution called ICE, which is an unfortunate acronym given America, but the Costa Rican Electricity Institute. 66% just of its generation was publicly owned. The other 7% was importantly co-ops, regional co-ops, worker-owned co-ops and things like that, where people had direct democratic control over what they did with the revenue of those generators, how they spent them in those communities, and had a say over what happened in their communities and what new renewable energy they built. The entire distribution network was publicly owned, which is not something we can say for Australia. And it was an institution that remains fiercely defended by organised labour in Costa Rica. The other really interesting one is in Preston, and Lancashire in the UK. And this is sort of coming up from the other angle, is what do you do when you publicly control institutions, and what do we mean by democratic public ownership? Preston was particularly bad hit by the recession and deindustrialisation in the UK. They had enormous social problems. Most of the young people were leaving, and in many ways sounds like a regional town in Queensland with a much bigger population. And what the council did and turned around is they went to every remaining public institution, so hospitals, police stations, universities, public schools, and they said, from now on, all the goods and services that you buy and large, need to be produced and manufactured in Preston. They could only do that because these institutions remained publicly owned. And they said that any services or manufacture that was provided needed to be established as worker cooperatives, in that rather than allowing private corporations to take over and start providing these services in Preston, there needs to be workers-controlled cooperatives within Lancashire and Preston that provided those services. And the results were astonishing. It's now one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing region in the UK. They completely overcame the issues with austerity being imposed by the national government. There's an extra 367 million Australian dollars being spent in that community every year now, which is remarkable. And they're just about to set up a publicly owned energy company and publicly owned bank that provides finance to workers' co-ops to set up. Cuba, which is very interesting in the context of there's a lot of problems with Cuba, but what's particularly amazing at the moment is that they're, as a result of the US trade embargo, were essentially cut off from the rest of the developed world in terms of pharmaceuticals. And so by just sheer necessity had to establish an entire publicly owned pharmaceutical industry, which they has won a series of sort of global awards and things like that. They were one of the first ones to pioneer a lung cancer vaccine, which is currently going through stage 3 clinical trials in the US. But what's remarkable is that they were ahead of the game when it comes to COVID vaccinations. And in fact, by August, they're going to have vaccinated 66% of their population, and they domestically manufacturing 5 different COVID vaccine candidates, which is genuinely incredible. In fact, by the end of the year, they plan to be exporting for free to third world countries their publicly and locally manufactured COVID vaccines. What's remarkable about this is because it was publicly owned and highly capable of an impressive amount of innovation, the Cuban president last year in March directed the entire pharmaceutical industry to put its entire sort of innovative and resource intensive focus on producing vaccines for COVID-19, which put them ahead of the game, and something that we weren't able to do in Australia because we had no democratic or public control over any of our pharmaceutical industry or capacity. The final one is Vienna, where that's actually just a cooperatively controlled public housing in Vienna with a fantastic garden, and there's a childcare centre embedded in the bottom there. 60% of residents live in some form of social housing in Vienna, which is about 440,000 social homes. So equivalent in scale to a place like Brisbane, for instance. And they have some of the lowest rates of homelessness and far less affected by the housing crisis that, say, we are in Australia. And this is when you start to get what they've been able to do as a result of this is tackle the housing crisis in a far more effective and direct way than bizarre attempts to corral the private market into providing something that it's not actually very good at providing, which is affordable housing for everyone. So the question is that I think this comes up a lot, but do we then just go back to what it was like in the 1990s and 1980s? And the answer emphatically probably has to be no, because as John alluded to, there are memories of those sort of, what we can't go down the path of is renationalising industries and just making the government the owner, but otherwise making it function and act in the same way that it currently acts. It's just that the revenue goes to the government, because we will not be able to build the public faith or buy into public institutions if we do that. And so one of the most important, probably the most effective places to start, and what I think we're excited about here, is that not only at a federal level, and there can be help and support there in terms of federal funding and things like that, but probably where we're going to be able to get the first wins on the board when it comes to building publicly owned institutions and institutions where the public have control over them and ownership over them, is at a council level or municipal level. Something like the Preston model. And the important thing about there is we don't stop there, but what we need to be able to do is start providing the material basis for people to start having a buy-in or interest in building those public institutions. Whether it be Brisbane City Council setting up a publicly owned energy company, or establishing a public bank to finance workers' co-ops or food co-ops in Brisbane. There are a number of ways that we can sort of start thinking about this, but what's really important is that the biggest challenge that the left faces at the moment is that we haven't been able to deliver on major social or economic reforms in a long time that give people faith that anything is actually good is actually possible, as opposed to a managed decline. And at a council level, funny saying this as someone running for Griffith, is one of those areas where we have a very good opportunity to start rebuilding public institutions that can act as prototypes for nationally publicly owned institutions. And to give you a really interesting example, the NHS came out of a public health, union health system designed by unionised coal miners. And that the prototype for the NHS, which is the publicly provided health system in the UK, came as a result of local successful examples of what public provision of healthcare would look like. And there's no reason why that can't happen again. And I think the final thing to say is that what's useful about this is that we are directly taking on the power of billionaires and big corporations. We talk about that a lot, but a lot of their power lies in the ability to discipline us, whether it be via housing, cost of electricity, fighting to ensure that they retain the lion's share of profits from our resource industry, and use that and hold that over us as an enormous amount of power that exists in a small number of private hands that's directed without any democratic say. We don't get to vote on the cost of our energy prices or how much renewable energy we build. That's all decided behind closed doors. And so thinking about it in those terms, I think, is very useful, because if we do want to fundamentally change society for the better, then the first thing we need to do is to put more power in the hands of ordinary people at the expense of the people that are currently running our economy and political system. Thanks, everyone.